Officer Mark Davies was a man who believed he had a sharp eye for trouble. With over a decade on the police force, he thought he could spot danger from a mile away. Sometimes, though, his instincts weren't always based on facts. They were based on something deeper, something he rarely questioned. It was a calm Wednesday afternoon, and the sun was shining on the quiet streets of Riverside, a suburban neighborhood where things rarely went wrong. Mark was patrolling in his police car, scanning the streets for anything unusual. He liked to believe he was the first line of defense for the town, always ready to act if needed. As he turned onto Elm Street, his eyes landed on a man walking on the sidewalk. The man was tall, well-dressed in a gray suit, and carried a black leather briefcase. His stride was confident, purposeful, and he didn't seem to notice the police car passing by. Mark immediately felt something stir inside him. Why is he walking here? He doesn't look like he belongs, Mark thought, though he couldn't put his finger on why. The man, Jamal Thompson, wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply on his way to an important meeting downtown. But to Mark, the combination of the briefcase, the confident walk, and, though he wouldn't admit it, the man's skin color made him suspicious. Mark decided to follow him. He slowed his car, keeping a short distance behind Jamal. At first, Jamal didn't notice, but after a few minutes, he became aware of the police car trailing him. He sighed, realizing what was happening. This wasn't the first time something like this had occurred. Jamal continued walking, hoping the officer would lose interest and move on. But when he reached the corner of Elm and Pine, Mark pulled his car over and stepped out. The sound of the car door closing made Jamal stop and turn around. "Excuse me, sir," Mark said, his tone firm but polite. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Jamal's heart sank, but he kept his composure. "Of course, officer," he replied calmly. "Is something wrong?" Mark tilted his head slightly. "We've had some reports about suspicious activity in the area," he said. It wasn't true, but it gave him a reason to stop Jamal. "I'd like to ask you a few questions." Jamal nodded, keeping his voice steady. "I'm just on my way to a meeting. Is there something specific you're looking for?" Mark's eyes drifted to the briefcase. "What's in the case?" he asked, the suspicion clear in his voice. Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Just documents for my meeting. It's personal business." Mark folded his arms, his tone growing sharper. "I'd like to take a look." Jamal's expression hardened. "With all due respect, officer, I don't believe you have the right to search my briefcase without a warrant." Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he had already decided was suspicious. Ignoring Jamal's words, Mark stepped closer, his hand reaching out. "Sir, I'm going to need to open that case." Jamal took a step back, holding his briefcase tighter. He wasn't angry, but he was frustrated. "Officer," he said in a calm but firm voice, "I know my rights. Unless you have a warrant or a legitimate reason, you can't search my belongings." Mark Davies felt his temper rising. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he suspected. In his mind, Jamal's resistance only made him seem guiltier. Mark squared his shoulders and stared at Jamal. "Look, I'm trying to do my job. If you've got nothing to hide, why not just let me take a look?" Jamal sighed, knowing this conversation was going nowhere. "It's not about hiding anything," he explained patiently. "It's about the law. I'm simply asking you to respect it." Mark's gaze flickered between Jamal's face and the briefcase. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. A part of him knew Jamal was right. This wasn't legal. But another part, the part that didn't like being told no, took over. "I'll ask you one last time," Mark said, his tone sharper now. "What's in the briefcase?" Jamal glanced around, noticing a few people walking in the distance. He wasn't worried about himself, but he knew this situation could escalate if he didn't stay calm. "I've already told you, officer," Jamal replied. "It's personal business documents. That's all." Mark took a step forward, reaching out for the briefcase. "Then you won't mind if I check for myself." Jamal's grip tightened, and his voice became firmer. "Officer, I do mind. You're crossing a line." But Mark didn't listen. Before Jamal could react, Mark grabbed the briefcase and yanked it from his hands. Jamal stood frozen for a moment, a mix of disbelief and disappointment on his face. "This is illegal," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of warning. "You're breaking the law." Mark ignored him. He placed the briefcase on the hood of his patrol car and quickly unlatched it. The moment the lid flipped open, he froze. His confident demeanor cracked, replaced by confusion and then panic. Inside the briefcase were neatly organized files, each labeled with precise titles. Mark skimmed through them, his eyes widening as he realized what he was looking at. These weren't ordinary business documents. They were legal papers, investigative reports, and a carefully compiled case against police misconduct. His name was written on several of the documents. Jamal stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Now you see, officer, why I didn't want you to open it." Mark's mind raced. The files detailed incidents he had hoped were long forgotten, complaints from citizens, reports of overstepping his authority, and even internal warnings from his own department. He could feel the blood draining from his face as the weight of his actions settled in. Jamal took out his phone and began recording. "This is being documented," he said. "Not just this moment, but everything that led up to it. You've crossed a line today, and it's going to have consequences." Mark didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, he felt completely out of control. He had opened a door he couldn't close, and now his career and reputation hung by a thread. Officer Mark Davies stood frozen, staring at the contents of the briefcase. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents, unable to believe what he was seeing. The neat folders were filled with detailed records, photographs, and signed statements. Each piece of paper seemed like a piece of a puzzle, and when put together, they painted a damning picture of his career. Jamal stood a few feet away, his calm demeanor unshaken. He held his phone steady, recording the officer's reaction. "Is this what you were looking for, Officer Davies?" Jamal asked, his voice carrying both authority and a sense of control. "I warned you this was private business." Mark swallowed hard. The files included reports of questionable stops, complaints filed by civilians, and even notes from internal investigations. Jamal had done his homework. Some of the incidents dated back years, things Mark thought had been buried or forgotten. He couldn't understand how Jamal had gotten hold of all this information. You've been investigating me?" Mark asked, his voice cracking slightly. He looked up at Jamal, his confidence drained. Jamal crossed his arms, his expression steady. "I'm not just investigating you, officer," he said. "I'm investigating a pattern, a system. Your name just happens to show up more than once." Mark's jaw tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to argue, but the evidence in front of him made it impossible. He looked down at the papers again, spotting a folder labeled Racial Profiling. "Officer Davies, Riverside PD." He flipped it open and saw charts and data that backed up the claim. His stomach churned. "You don't understand," Mark said, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is out of context. I'm just doing my job." "Your job," Jamal said, raising an eyebrow. "Is your job to follow someone who's done nothing wrong? Is it to stop them without cause? Or is it to ignore the law you're supposed to uphold?" His words were steady but cut deep. Mark clenched his fists but said nothing. He glanced at the small crowd gathering on the sidewalk. People had started to notice the confrontation, and some had pulled out their phones to record. The pressure mounted as Mark realized this wasn't just between him and Jamal anymore. "Do you know what's worse than what you've done today?" Jamal asked, stepping closer. "It's that you thought you could get away with it. That no one would call you out. That's why I'm here, officer. That's why I carry this briefcase." Mark's breathing quickened. His career had always been a balancing act, pushing boundaries without consequences. But now, standing under the weight of Jamal's evidence, he felt the walls closing in. You should know, Jamal continued, this isn't just about today. Everything you've done has been documented. People are tired, officer. And now, the world will see what's been happening. Mark's hands dropped to his sides. He felt powerless. The confident cop who had stopped Jamal just minutes ago now stood like a man watching his life unravel. The briefcase, which he had thought would reveal some hidden wrongdoing by Jamal, had instead exposed his own. Jamal took a deep breath, still holding his phone up. I think we're done here, officer. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. Mark didn't respond. For the first time in his career, he felt the consequences of his actions catching up to him. Officer Mark Davies stood there, his mind racing, while Jamal calmly put his briefcase back together. The weight of what had just happened felt heavier with every passing second. The crowd nearby grew larger, their curious eyes and recording phones capturing everything. Mark could feel the pressure building, but Jamal was still in control. Let me make something clear, Jamal said, locking his briefcase. His tone was steady but firm. This isn't just about you, Officer Davies. This is about accountability. This is about making sure people like me don't have to keep living in fear of being stopped for no reason. Mark shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. He felt trapped, knowing that anything he said could make things worse. The crowd murmured among themselves, some clearly on Jamal's side, others unsure of what to think. The air was thick with tension, but Jamal remained composed, his calmness a sharp contrast to the officer's unease. You probably think you were just doing your job, Jamal continued, taking a step closer. But let me ask you this. What made you stop me today? Was it the briefcase, my suit, or was it the fact that I don't look like the people you think belong in this neighborhood? Mark opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. He didn't have a good answer. Deep down, he knew why he had stopped Jamal, but admitting it, even to himself, wasn't something he was ready to do. That's what I thought, Jamal said, his voice cutting through the silence. You don't have an answer because you know there was no reason. You stopped me because you could. You opened my briefcase because you thought no one would question you. But here's the thing. You've been wrong before. And now everyone's going to see it. Mark's face reddened, but he remained silent. Jamal turned to the crowd, raising his voice slightly. This isn't just about me. This happens to people every day. People who don't have the resources to fight back. People who are silenced or ignored. But not this time. The crowd seemed to grow more interested. Some nodded in agreement, and others started recording more actively. Mark felt his grip on the situation slipping further. He glanced toward his patrol car, wishing he could escape, but he knew that walking away now would only make him look worse. I spent months collecting evidence, Jamal said, turning back to Mark. Not just on you, but on the system you represent. This is bigger than today, officer. This is about making sure people in positions of power are held accountable. Mark clenched his fists but didn't respond. He felt the weight of Jamal's words pressing down on him. For the first time, he realized how much damage his actions had caused, not just to his own career, but to the trust people should have in law enforcement. Jamal took a deep breath, his calm never wavering. You're going to hear from my lawyer, he said firmly. And when this goes public, I hope you take a good, hard look at yourself. Maybe then you'll understand what it feels like to be judged unfairly. With that, Jamal turned and walked away, his briefcase in hand. The crowd parted as he passed, some clapping softly, others murmuring in agreement. Mark stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of his actions settle heavily on his shoulders. The officer didn't follow Jamal. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, realizing that his life and his career would never be the same. After Jamal walked away, Officer Mark Davies remained standing on the sidewalk, feeling as though the ground had been pulled from beneath him. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his chest. His heart pounded in his ears, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but Mark didn't move. His mind raced, replaying the events over and over. What had I done? He thought. Why did I let myself go this far? He looked down at the open briefcase on the hood of his patrol car. The papers were scattered across the surface, some falling onto the pavement. He reached down, picking them up one by one, his hands trembling. He tried to force himself to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to Jamal's words. Jamal had been calm, controlled, and confident. Mark, on the other hand, had acted impulsively, something he rarely did. He had always prided himself on being able to handle difficult situations with authority, but today he had crossed a line. He had no legitimate reason to stop Jamal, and the search had been completely illegal. The realization hit him hard. His own actions had just set the stage for his downfall. He scanned the papers once more, and this time he understood just how much trouble he was in. There, in the neatly organized files, were records of complaints against him, things he had hoped would stay buried. But Jamal had somehow found them all. It was clear that Jamal wasn't just another civilian. He was an investigator, someone who had done his homework. The internal investigations, the citizen complaints, the reports about his use of force. They were all there. And even worse, his name appeared multiple times throughout the documents, each time linked to accusations of racial profiling, abuse of power, and misconduct. His face flushed with shame as he realized that his entire career was built on questionable choices, and now those choices were exposed for the world to see. Mark wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, trying to steady himself. What now? He thought, panic rising in his chest. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the papers, but it felt like hours. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Jamal's evidence was not just damaging, it was devastating. It was clear that his career was now at the mercy of whatever Jamal decided to do next. The feeling of panic only grew stronger when Mark heard the sound of an approaching siren. His first instinct was to hide the documents, but it was too late. He could already hear voices from the crowd, some of them still recording, talking about the incident. The reality was that everyone knew now. Everyone had seen him break the rules. His badge, the symbol of authority, now seemed meaningless. The siren grew louder, and Mark turned around to see another police car pulling up to the scene. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure who was in the car, but he knew this wouldn't be a simple talk-it-out situation. His own department was likely already being called, and the news of his actions was sure to spread fast. He took one last look at the papers before gathering them up and stuffing them into the briefcase. As he did, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Mark pulled it out, his eyes widening as he saw a notification. Jamal's video had already been posted online. There was no turning back now. Mark's career was on the line, and the worst part was that he couldn't even deny what had happened. The truth was there, in black and white. Mark's heart raced as he watched the notification on his phone. Jamal had already uploaded the video of their encounter to social media, and within minutes it was everywhere. The footage spread like wildfire, making its way through the community, the city, and even the news channels. It was undeniable. People had seen it, shared it, and commented on it. The moment Jamal had calmly confronted Mark and revealed the documents, it had been captured for the world to see. Mark stood in front of his patrol car, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His hands were shaking, and his mind was spinning. He had never imagined that one simple stop, one impulsive decision, could lead to this. He looked around, seeing more police cars pulling up in the distance. The sirens were getting louder, and Mark knew the department was already responding to the crisis he had created. He could hear the whispers from the crowd. Some people looked at him with judgment in their eyes, while others were still holding up their phones, recording. It was as though he had become the center of a storm he couldn't control. "Did you see the video?" One woman asked her friend, her voice filled with disbelief. That cop really thought he could just open the guy's briefcase like that. Mark's face flushed with embarrassment. He tried to hold his composure, but deep down, he knew he had lost control of the situation. This wasn't just about a bad decision anymore. It was about public trust, and he had shattered it. Soon, the footage was on the news. A local reporter was speaking about the incident, showing clips of Mark grabbing Jamal's briefcase and ignoring his request for a lawful search. The report quickly shifted to Jamal's calm explanation of his rights and the crowd that had gathered around them. The video showed the moment Jamal turned the camera on, giving his viewers a front-row seat to the shocking encounter. The more Mark watched, the worse it got. The news anchor discussed the growing outrage from the community, especially among people who had experienced similar behavior from officers in the past. People across social media were commenting on the video, with many showing their support for Jamal. Others were demanding that Mark be held accountable for his actions. A social media hashtag Justice for Jamal began to trend. It wasn't long before other incidents involving officers in the same department came to light. People who had been silent before were now speaking out, sharing their stories of racial profiling, unfair treatment, and discrimination. The video had become a spark, igniting a fire of voices that had been waiting for a reason to be heard. Mark's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his supervisor, Sergeant Willis. "Get to the station now. We need to talk." Panic shot through Mark. He quickly put his phone away and climbed into his patrol car, feeling like all eyes were on him. As he drove to the station, he thought about what would happen next. His career was in jeopardy. The department was already under pressure from the public, and now he had given them more than they could handle. The weight of his actions settled heavier with every mile. Mark knew that even if the department didn't fire him immediately, there would be investigations, lawsuits, and endless media coverage. His reputation, built over years of service, was now crumbling before his eyes. As Mark pulled into the police station parking lot, he glanced around. Officers were walking in and out, but none of them made eye contact with him. He could feel the shift in the air. Things had changed, and he didn't know if they would ever go back to the way they were. The storm had only just begun. Mark's palms were sweaty as he parked his patrol car in front of the police station. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his mind was racing. The viral video of his encounter with Jamal had already reached every corner of the city. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with calls, texts, and notifications. The reality of the situation was sinking in deeper with every passing minute. He stepped out of the car, his legs feeling heavier than usual. As he walked toward the entrance of the station, Mark noticed several officers glancing his way. Some of them quickly turned their heads, avoiding eye contact. It was as if the entire station had heard the news and was already forming opinions about him. He knew that their trust in him, his colleagues, was now in question. Inside the station, Mark was immediately greeted by Sergeant Willis, who was standing near the entrance, arms crossed and a stern expression on his face. "Davies," the sergeant said sharply, "we need to talk. Now." Mark nodded, feeling a pit form in his stomach. He followed the sergeant into his office, where the door closed behind them. Sergeant Willis motioned for Mark to sit down, but Mark remained standing, not wanting to sit in front of the man who was clearly disappointed in him. "I'm sure you've seen the video," Sergeant Willis said, his voice cold. "It's all over the news. Social media is blowing up with comments, and I've been getting calls all afternoon from the mayor's office. You've put this department in a very bad position." Mark swallowed hard, but couldn't find the words to respond. The weight of the situation was too heavy. The sergeant's gaze was piercing, and Mark could feel the disappointment radiating from him. "Tell me, Davies," Sergeant Willis continued, his voice softening only slightly. "Why did you do it? Why did you stop him? You've been on this force long enough to know better. What made you act like this?" Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He knew there was no good excuse, no way to explain away his actions. He had let his bias, his assumptions, take over. He had made a decision based on nothing more than a feeling a feeling he knew was wrong. And now he had to face the consequences. "I don't know, sir," Mark finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought he was doing something suspicious, but I didn't have any real reason to stop him. I've made mistakes, and I've been careless." Sergeant Willis sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Careless? Davies, this is more than carelessness. This is a violation of the trust we're supposed to uphold. You've been a police officer long enough to know that the law applies to everyone. You don't get to pick and choose who it applies to." Mark felt the sting of the surgeon's words. The truth was, he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. And now, everyone, his department, the public, would see it. There was no hiding from the reality of what he had done. "Do you realize what this means for you?" Sergeant Willis asked, his voice rising. "You've jeopardized everything. Your career, our department's reputation. It's all on the line now." Mark nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the consequences pressing down on him. He had never imagined it would come to this. One bad decision had led to the unraveling of everything he had worked for. He couldn't undo what had already been done. "We'll need to launch an internal investigation," Sergeant Willis continued. "There's no way around it. You'll be placed on administrative leave until further notice. The mayor is demanding answers, and the press is already circling. Your actions have put us in the spotlight, and we need to address this immediately." Mark's heart sank. Administrative leave. Investigation. It felt like everything was falling apart in front of him. But the worst part was knowing that his actions had hurt not just his career, but also the trust people had in the police force. He had let them down. Sergeant Willis stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "Get your things and go home for now. We'll be in touch with you about the next steps." Mark nodded, silently standing up and walking toward the door. As he stepped out of the office, he felt the weight of the entire department's eyes on him. He knew that his future, his place in the police force, was now uncertain. Jamal sat at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he read through the latest news reports about the incident with Officer Mark Davies. The video he had posted was everywhere. News outlets were discussing it, social media was buzzing, and the public was demanding change. He had expected some attention, but not like this. The video had gone viral quickly, and Jamal knew this wasn't just about one officer making a mistake. It was bigger than that. His goal wasn't just to expose Officer Davies, but to shed light on the deeper issues of racial profiling and police misconduct. He had been collecting evidence for months, but now it was clear that this was the moment he had been waiting for. He scrolled through a few social media posts, many of them showing support for his actions. People were sharing their own experiences of being stopped by the police for no reason, stories of unfair treatment and discrimination. It was as if Jamal had opened a door, and now people were stepping forward to speak out. Jamal had always known that police officers like Mark Davies were not isolated cases. He had seen it too many times. People of color being treated differently, being judged before they even had a chance to prove themselves. He had experienced it firsthand. But now, with the video and the growing support from the public, he felt like he was part of something much larger. He paused for a moment and took a deep breath. He wasn't just documenting the problem anymore. He was part of the solution. The lawsuit he had prepared was ready to be filed. It wasn't just about Officer Davies. It was about holding the entire system accountable. The police department, and even the city itself, needed to face the consequences of their actions. Jamal's phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from his lawyer. "The department has reached out. They want to settle." Jamal frowned. A settlement was a good thing, right? It meant they were willing to acknowledge the problem. But at the same time, he knew that a quick settlement might not be enough. He didn't just want an apology. He wanted real change. He wanted policy reform, training for officers, and a commitment to ending racial profiling. He replied to the message quickly. "We're not settling unless it includes real change. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been unfairly treated by the system. Jamal leaned back in his chair and stared out the window. He had spent years studying the system, learning about how change could be made. And now, with the momentum from the viral video and public support, he had a chance to push for the changes he knew were needed. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a journalist. "Would you be willing to do an interview? The story is gaining traction, and we'd love to have your perspective." Jamal hesitated for only a moment before typing a reply. "Absolutely. This is bigger than me. It's about everyone who has faced this kind of treatment. The time for change is now." As Jamal sent the message, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as an ordinary walk down the street had turned into a movement. It wasn't just about exposing one bad officer. It was about changing the way the entire system worked. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He had been fighting for justice for years, but now the world was listening. Jamal was determined to see it through, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly. The road ahead was long, but the momentum was on his side. Change was coming, and Jamal was going to make sure of it. The days that followed the viral video were a whirlwind. Officer Mark Davies couldn't escape the constant media coverage. His face was everywhere, on the news, online, and in newspapers. His actions had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, and there was no turning back. Within days, the police department began its internal investigation. It didn't take long for them to review the video, along with the complaints and evidence Jamal had gathered. The weight of his actions was undeniable. The department could no longer ignore the accusations or sweep them under the rug. Mark had been placed on administrative leave while the investigation took place. He was no longer out on the streets in uniform, no longer patrolling the neighborhood he had once felt so confident in. He sat in his apartment, glued to his phone and the constant updates about his case. He could feel his world falling apart with every headline. The news was relentless. Support for Jamal was growing, and people from across the country were backing him. Activists, community leaders, and even former officers began to speak out, urging for police reform and an end to racial profiling. The video had started a movement, and it was only gaining momentum. Meanwhile, Jamal was working tirelessly, pushing forward with the lawsuit. He wasn't just after a quick settlement. He wanted real change: mandatory training for officers, body cameras for every patrol car, and strict policies against racial profiling. He knew this was his moment to make a lasting impact. Then, the news broke. The police department had completed its investigation, and the findings were clear. Officer Mark Davies had been found guilty of misconduct. His actions violated department policy, and he had acted without cause when stopping Jamal. The report also highlighted his previous complaints for racial profiling and unnecessary force. As a result, Davies was officially terminated from the police force. Mark sat in shock as he read the news. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his position as an officer gave him power. But now, all of that was gone. His career had ended, and there was no coming back. He would not only lose his job, but also his pension and any future prospects in law enforcement. While the decision to fire Mark was a significant one, the ripple effects were felt far beyond just one officer's career. Jamal's efforts had forced a conversation that couldn't be ignored any longer. The public was demanding change, and the pressure on the police department was immense. The department promised to implement new policies, including better training for officers, stricter rules on when and how searches could be conducted, and increased transparency with the community. Jamal, while glad to see the department taking action, knew this was just the beginning. The settlement he had been negotiating with the city was finally signed, and it included the reforms he had been advocating for. He knew that real change would take time, but the first steps had been made. As the months passed, Jamal continued to speak out, using his platform to raise awareness about systemic issues within law enforcement. His work didn't stop with Mark Davies' firing. He was now a leading voice in the movement for police reform, and he traveled across the country, meeting with lawmakers, activists, and citizens to share his story and push for change. Mark, on the other hand, struggled to adjust to his new life. The weight of his actions hung over him, and he couldn't escape the reality that he had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system. He had lost his career, and now he would have to live with the consequences. But despite the fall of one officer, Jamal's victory was about more than just holding Mark Davies accountable. It was about giving hope to countless others who had been silenced for far too long. His efforts had sparked a movement, and though the road ahead was long, it was clear that things were starting to change.